sense of, whether or not it's criminal justice reform.
Hey everyone, welcome. Happy new semester, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome back to everyone here at Duke Law, and even bigger welcome to our visitors. I want to really thank the Criminal Law Society and Juliet Park for putting on this event. We have been meeting as part of a little mini conference sponsored by the Center of Science and Justice here at the law school, our new center here, which I've been directing, a conference to talk about what it means to write criminal justice books, and we're giving each other feedback on our books. But today here at lunch, we're not talking about rough drafts or works in progress. We're celebrating a really exciting book that is done, it's published, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have Professor Eisha Natapoff here to talk about her book, Punishment Without Crime. And we tend to think as lawyers that, there should be a crime if one is punished. And yet, well, as our panelists will discuss, there's the system of punishment for things that aren't exactly crimes is vast in scale, and her book has done more than anything to expose the scale and the consequences of this problem. Eisha is coming to us cross-country from University of California, Irvine School of Law, where she's a chancellor professor. Her first book is also well worth reading. It's called Snitching. I think most of you know what that is. We have on our panel to talk about the book, and I told them, and by the way, that Duke Law students are so engaged and are going to be so participatory that they should really keep their comments short, like way less than 10 minutes per person, so that we have lots of time for all of your questions and all of your engagement. And so that's what they're going to be doing. So this is your panel. This is your event. So that said, before you all jump in, we're going to have Professor Adam Gershowitz talk. He's the Arhue and Nellie Hines Professor of Law at William & Mary and the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty. He is a UVA law alum. I used to teach there, so I have some warm feelings as to that. Eisha Policy Forum, which created something that some of you may have heard of called Right on Crime, which spearheaded a whole range of criminal justice reforms in Texas and in a number of other states. So we're going to hear from our panelists first for like 5 to 8 minutes each. And Eisha can respond to the extent that she would like to, and I really, she'll obviously introduce herself and her work as well. And then we'll really look forward to hearing all of your questions, concerns, comments, and having a big discussion. Thank you all so much, and welcome to this incredible panel.
I didn't know I was going to go first. All right, so I'll just start with the obvious truth, which is that the misdemeanor system is messed up, seriously messed up, and this book is an exceptional tour through why it's messed up, and quite frankly, just as an outset point, what it is we don't know about the criminal justice system. And so I thought I'd use like a little short metaphor in under 5 minutes to do that. I want you to think about Duke Law School and what we know about Duke Law School, right? So we know the number of students that are in this building, the number of JD students, LLM students. We know the average LSAT, GPA by 25 and 75th percentile. We know the required courses. We know definitions of the course, a course catalog here, right, that explains to you what the course is actually supposed to be. There's information about employment outcomes. There's a student handbook that describes the procedure for everything, your rights, your responsibilities, all in plain language. You know a lot of stuff about this school. I don't go here. I know a lot of stuff about this school at this point. Compare what's going on in the misdemeanor system when you read Professor Natapoff's book. She does a fabulous job of pointing out to you what it is that we actually don't know, that we should know. So we don't know the number of misdemeanor offenses there actually are in the United States, which is staggering, right? People who are put through the system don't have an understanding. There is no handbook that explains it. There is no course catalog that's going to break down the offenses by like, this is what the government needs to prove to lock you up. There's nothing that walks you through the basics of this system. And the major contribution of the book, before you even get to the part about describing how the system itself is messed up, is just showing us how much we don't know about it. The other thing that I think is a second contribution that is a fabulous addition to thinking about this is the response when people point out, we want this information, why can't we have it? So I'll give you a couple of sort of metaphorical ways to think about this. None of them are true about Duke Law School, but just think about it by way of analogy. Let's say this would never happen. Let's just say there's an allegation that the Duke faculty were physically or verbally abusive in class, right? In a way that prison guards or jail guards are physically abusive. Or let's imagine that there was a policy at Duke where we favored some students over another and in the clerkship process, or perhaps that the Career Services Office was underfunded. We object to potentially the policies that are here that are kind of hidden, or that the offices are understaffed, or we're pushing students into jobs that we don't think they really want to be in, the same way the criminal justice system pushes people to plead guilty in a way that we're concerned about. We sort of have all these concerns about it. Imagine if we went to the dean of the law school. Let's imagine have you ever heard of a thing called Above the Law? Let's imagine Above the Law calls the dean of the law school and says, we've heard this and we've heard that and we're worried about this and we'd like some information. And instead of giving that information, they give the answers that Professor Natapoff gets when she tries to gather this information. Things like, I don't know the answer to your question. Why do you need to know that? No one has this information, or I'd be happy to respond to your FOIA. And I feel comfortable to say would not be the dean of the law school if that's the way that they responded to legitimate questions for information. And so 2 major contributions to the book are to sort of show us what it is we don't know and the astounding response we get when we try to know things that we should really be looking for. And then 2 other things, super fast, holding or handling them. The last point that I'll offer is the what do we do about it? So when you read her book, you get a giant sense of this mess. And the what to do about it is quite challenging. And so the one suggestion I'd offer that isn't in the book, but I wrote you always have to sort of promote your own article, so here we go. I wrote an article last year about how do we keep inputs from actually getting into the system in the first place? And one way that we might think about doing that is just to raise the sort of economic cost that exists to police officers about bringing cases into the system in the first place. And so a rather startling thing that I'll offer is, and you never use Harris County or Houston, Texas as an example for something that's going right, but bear with me for just a second. In Harris County, police officers are not actually allowed to arrest and bring into custody anyone unless they first call the DA's office and go through an intake prosecutor to get permission to make that arrest. If they make the arrest without doing that, that person actually cannot be checked into the jail in Harris County, Texas. And so this has been going on there for 30 or 40 years. It doesn't happen in most other places. What does that do? It screens a lot of cases out of the system that shouldn't be there in the first place, and it prevents them from dealing with the expression, it's not the rap, it's the ride. It prevents them from sort of suffering the consequences of the procedural system that they have to deal with once they're in, that are all the indignities and difficulties and costs and things that we want to avoid in the first place. And so one thing that we might think about as a society is, what steps, either in the prosecutor's office or the police department, can we put into effect that prevent us from having to deal with people in the system that shouldn't be there in the first place, and to keep them out, not to worry about the process to free them or to deal with them once they're out. And I think a lot of Aisha's work has looked at all of these problems, and so I will cede the floor so she can talk about what she wants to talk about.
I am going to sound like a bit of an echo chamber, because I also have to start off by saying that this book is just so enormously valuable. It's, I think the main contribution for me has been that it's shined a light on a system that we never talk about when we talk about what the criminal law is in the standard first-year criminal law course. So if all you knew about the criminal law was what you learned in the standard first-year criminal law course, you'd think that a whole lot of murderers are out there, right? We spend about a month on homicide in pretty much any criminal law course you take. By contrast, we often don't spend any time on misdemeanors, which are actually the bulk of the work that the criminal justice system does. In your standard first-year criminal law course, you talk about punishment, right? The big question is this person guilty? Should they be punished, right? And by punish, what we mean is punishment in a very formal sense. All you talk about in the first-year course is what the formal criminal sentence is. So what happens in the misdemeanor world is that there's all these very costly consequences that are imposed on people who are being processed through these courts that don't fit within the legal definition of punishment. So a low-level misdemeanor conviction or even a misdemeanor arrest can bar you from being eligible to live in public housing. It can have consequences for various things like eligibility for student loans. It can result in immigration consequences if you are a lawful permanent resident. None of these things fall within the definition of punishment. The other thing that is, one other aspect of this work that I think is so helpful is the discussion that Professor Natapoff does about the hassle and the degradation that is a part of the misdemeanor process. So before coming and getting to be a law professor, I had a wonderful job as a civil rights lawyer. And at one point in my career, I represented someone who had been charged with a marijuana misdemeanor in New York City. He was arrested near the NYU dorms because a police officer thought that he was smoking a marijuana cigarette because he was holding a cigarette like this, and there was a heavy smell of marijuana in the air. So as any of you who have been near the NYU dorms on a summer night know, it is pretty common to have the smell of marijuana in the air. So this guy happened to actually be innocent, and I represented him, and eventually his case was dismissed. But not before he had to have multiple court appearances and explain to his boss, I've been arrested for this thing. It's really not a big deal. I just have to go to court again and again and again. So my client happened to be innocent, but the way that this system works is that it produces convictions because the rational decision for a lot of people who are in that circumstance is to just take a quick plea as quickly as they can because that seems like it's the least harmful alternative. So this all raises the question, what is the system doing? So one last thing that I want to say about the value in the way that Professor Natapoff has framed her work is that she's shown that we often think about misdemeanors as being an alternative to more formal criminal punishment. So what we might often hear is that, this person doesn't deserve to be punished, right? Let's do something that's less weighty, right? Something like a misdemeanor or something that is a fine-only offense. So part of what Professor Natapoff's scholarship has done is to show how this can actually contribute to net widening. We're putting people into a system by criminalizing low-level activity that really shouldn't be criminalized in the first place. And I think this offers a very helpful way about thinking about what is the justification for this form of government control over over activity that's quite common in many areas.
I love the book, just like you guys loved it too, but I'll offer some critical comments actually, and I'm actually turning them at myself because I love the book. And I want to ask myself, did you just love the book because you agreed with it and you agreed with all of its various ideas and theses? There are people out there who disagree, and I'm trying to think critically about why they disagree and why I disagree with them and who's right. And I think we should talk about that for just a moment. My basic view of the world is that, yeah, there are real problems out there, but sometimes when the government gets involved, they actually end up making the problems worse. I don't like when somebody litters, but at the end of the day, when you start issuing fines, and then when fines rack up and people get caught in a system where they can eventually even get arrested, even if they don't get arrested, they have to pay back absurd amounts of money that they can't necessarily afford. Little things like this, I find myself wondering, is it really worth it? And so I agree with the basic premise of the book, that the misdemeanor system is to some extent a bit out of control. Now, having said that, maybe I can afford to agree with the premise of the book because I live in a certain kind of neighborhood. I live in Washington, D.C., and my neighborhood is like the poster child for gentrification, okay? Nobody is littering in my neighborhood. They're not littering because they're worried about getting a ticket or a fine. It's just a norm. We just don't do that kind of thing. That's also, I grew up in Texas in the suburbs of Fort Worth. That was a pretty clean neighborhood. Also, those kinds of things didn't happen. A lot of, petty crimes do happen. I guarantee there's a lot of jaywalking in my neighborhood. But set that aside, there's a lot of petty quality of life crimes, as you call them in the book, as they're called colloquially, that just don't take place. But if I lived in a neighborhood where those kinds of things did take place all the time, I might be upset about them. I might be concerned, and I might demand that the government take action. I might demand action from law enforcement. I had a friend who died last year. Some of you in the room will know Professor Mark Kleiman, who was a great scholar in criminal justice policy, particular drug policy. I remember talking to him once about survey data, about what people in high crime neighborhoods care about. And he said, it's interesting, Vikrant, they don't actually say, kind of like as you pointed out, well, I'm worried about all the murders. There are actually very few of those. They complain about public order, quality of life type issues. They say, well, it's dirty out there. There's graffiti everywhere. The kids are hanging out in the corner. They're not doing anything. They don't like the litter. They don't like these kinds of things. People driving too fast on the road. In their communities, that's what they're upset about. That's what they view as a fundamental criminal justice problem. Again, I wonder whether or not they're overthinking those things. But as I said, I don't live in those communities, and I think it's worth maybe, showing some respect to their views and what it is that they're concerned about. That gets us into a tricky area because it takes us into something like broken windows policing. Now, if you're somebody like me, and probably like all of us on the panel, we're really concerned about the counterproductive effects of broken windows policing. There's a lot of evidence out there that suggests that it just wrecks trust between police and local communities. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that whenever you get rid of trust, it makes it a lot harder to tackle crime in neighborhoods, serious crimes. People are afraid of going to the police and talking about what they know. But on the other hand, there's also some evidence out there that broken windows tends to work. There is evidence out there that if what you're looking to do is to establish a certain amount of public order and just keep the area cleaner and nicer because people are less likely to commit crimes in those areas, there's something to that. Again, I want to be measured about the claims that are being made here because even if it does work, you could have these other unintended consequences that make it broadly more counterproductive. But there is evidence that it's effective. And there's a lot of people out there who want it, who live in these neighborhoods. I'll close with an anecdote about this. Brandon mentioned in the, or Professor Garrett, since that's what the students call you. Professor Garrett mentioned in the introduction that I used to work at this think tank where I did a lot of public advocacy. And I remember in 2015, there was a state legislator who had brought this anti-littering bill to the state legislature. And he came from, I was in Texas, which is where I'm from, and he came from a part of Houston that's a heavily black community. It's called Fifth Ward, for those of you who know Houston or Harris County. And the legislator himself was African American. And he said that littering had just gotten out of control in his community. He suspected it was probably a problem in many parts of the state. And the way the law was structured at the time, you couldn't actually get arrested for littering. They could just write citations for you. And he wanted to include a provision in the law that would have had at least a small amount of jail time as a possible sentence that you could receive. So I testified against the bill. I made a very provocative argument, but I bet one that a lot of people in the room will agree with. I said, we're all engaged in a process here where we're trying to think seriously about the number of young black men who are behind bars in America and reduce that figure. And I actually think that Representative Miles's legislation is going to take us in the wrong direction because you're empowering these police officers to make day-to-day decisions about who they're going to give tickets to. The police officers are policing very frequently African-American neighborhoods. That's where they're walking their beats. That's where they, many of them are located for law enforcement purposes. And disproportionately, a lot of these tickets are going to be written to these young black men who are, doing something petty like tossing a Coca-Cola can or something like that out the window. And a lot of them, because of his bill, are going to find themselves in a position where they have to go to jail. And I just don't know that that's what we want. I won that fight. That did not pass in Texas. The legislator was mad, though. He gave me a piece of his mind afterwards. And I think about that a lot because I know the way the legislative process works. The representative didn't just come up with a bill out of thin air. People in his community came to his office and said, we don't like the littering. We don't like the quality of life crimes that are taking place all around us, and we want to find a way to crack down on them. So anyway, I'll stop now. All of that is simply to say that I agree with the broad thrust of the book, but I hope that we're also taking the concerns of these other folks seriously. You have a really provocative line at one point where you say, we're talking about quality of life crimes with quality of life for who? And what you're asking about is what about the young black man in my hypothetical who's getting arrested his quality of life is being diminished, or is, excuse me, having a citation written that he has to pay ungodly amounts of sums for. But, you know, when people talk about the quality of life of the people who simply live in the neighborhood, that is worth thinking about too. And I wonder how we can incorporate their concerns into criminal justice reform moving forward. But I did love the book.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here and taking this time to read the book, to think about it, to share your insights. Thank you all for coming and spending some time here today to think about these issues. So I'm going to take the opportunity, since I'm at a law school, to behave like a law professor, and I'm going to write on the board just for a moment. I promise it's only 2 things, and you don't have to remember them. This is 20%. Here, let's do this one in red. This is 1 to 2%. And if you can't read my handwriting, it says innocence, money, and race. So I want to talk for a second about what I hoped that the book would accomplish, and a little bit about the analysis that I share in the book, and then I want to respond to these really wonderful insights from the panel. So as a couple of folks have mentioned, one of the goals of the book was to reveal just how much of our criminal system is about misdemeanors. As you all probably know now, technically, we often define misdemeanor as an offense for which a person can serve no more than 1 year. But that's a very techie sort of legal definition. It really refers to this enormous world of criminal regulation that we use to impose relatively low-level penalties on people for common conduct, ranging from jaywalking and order maintenance crimes to more serious kinds of minor conduct, simple assault, minor theft, and then, of course, as has been mentioned, DUI and domestic violence. It's an enormous world. It is 80% of American criminal dockets are misdemeanors. We're learning more. I'll talk a little bit about Adam's point about, I'm sorry, Professor
Adam's fine.
point about how much we do and don't know, but we are learning just how consistently our system relies on misdemeanors. So 20% of American criminal dockets are felonies. There are between 3 or 4 million felonies filed in state courts every year. The federal government, as you know, very important, but represents a tiny sliver, less than 5% of all criminal cases in this country. And the 1% and 2%, as Professor Jain pointed out, this is murder and rape. This is what we study in law school. So we spend an inordinate amount of time theorizing the most serious offenses as a paradigm, right, as a template for understanding what it is our criminal system does, and it's misleading. Because mostly what it does is this. And it does it in these sloppy, non-transparent, often lawless ways about which we tend to lack information because low transparency spaces tend to keep poor records and tend not to explain themselves very well. And so the idea, the purpose of the book was to bring this reality to light, to cause us to pay more attention to it, and then to grapple more rigorously with these very difficult questions that Vikrant raises and that many of us has grappled with for many years, was just, so what do we do? Murder is not a good model for figuring out whether we should have misdemeanors, whether we should treat conduct criminally. We don't get to worry about that in the case of homicide because we know that we want state intervention. We know that this is harmful, socially destructive conduct that warrants state intervention and the strongest state response. That's not true for loitering. We have to have a different conversation about what kind of democracy we want to live in and what work we want our criminal system to do. So the idea of understanding the scope of the amount of governance work that our misdemeanor system is doing is a way of surfacing the question of what kind of really, at the end of the day, what kind of democracy do we want to have? And what role do we think our criminal system, as it actually is, not as we imagine it to be, but as it actually is, what role, what work is it doing? In the book, so in addition to describing and providing some more empirical data that I collected in order to write the book and talking about the law, I argue that there are at least 3 major issues that we need to grapple with in order to understand the role that the misdemeanor system is playing, and we can understand them through the lenses of innocence, money, and race. And just very briefly, and we just spent some wonderful time this morning talking about innocence challenges in our book seminar. Over the past 10 or 20 years, the innocence movement has really been one of the most profound, eye-opening and reform trends in the criminal justice system. We realize that we convict innocent people for the most serious crimes. The system does not work the way it's supposed to, does not work the way we think it should, and we almost never think about misdemeanor wrongful convictions, and yet there are probably hundreds of thousands of them, not because the eyewitness got it wrong, not because the lineup was non-neutral, not because the jailhouse snitch lied, but because the process is sloppy, because no one's paying attention, because we don't check facts, and because people are under an inordinate amount of pressure to plead guilty in order to get out of jail, to get back to their lives, to their children, to their work, and they plead guilty to these low-level offenses. So we have an enormous innocence docket in the world of misdemeanors that we haven't even started to grapple with yet. As many of you are aware, after the Department of Justice issued its Ferguson report in 2015, the country has really started to grapple with the role of money driving our criminal system, fines and fees and debtors, prison, the fact that the criminal system is essentially secretly taxing criminal defendants in order to run its own operations. We can't understand this enormous world of misdemeanors without understanding how it is a way of criminalizing poverty and also a covert form of taxation that permits the criminal system to run itself. And then finally, you know, the past decade of deepening awareness about the racial role played by mass incarceration, I think, has really put the whole country on notice that race is an inextricable part of the meaning of our criminal system. And yet it is misdemeanors that really represent the first step in the racialization of crime. Before anyone goes to prison, jurisdictions are engaging in racially disparate stop and frisk practices, arrest practices, drug arrest practices. Jaywalking is a famous example where there's just wild racial disparities in arrest and citation rates. It's misdemeanors is in effect that first moment when the state affirmatively reaches out in communities of color and towards people of color, particularly African-American men, but not only, to mark people as criminal, to give them that first record, that first experience with jail, that first experience with the coercive power of the state. And with 13 million cases every year, we're doing it on a massive scale. And so I argue in the book that through these lenses, we can understand more in a more powerful and nuanced way the kinds of work that our misdemeanor system is doing, and that we need to rethink our vocabulary. We can't just keep recycling the words that we use with felonies, the terms and the principles and the philosophies that we use with felonies in order to understand really what it is that our criminal system is doing in the main. Professor Gershowitz is right, we don't have that much information, but we have more than ever. There are new efforts around the country to start to pay attention to data collection about misdemeanors and low-level dockets. Since we're in North Carolina, it may be of interest to Representative Alma Adams, who is in the district, I think, right next door. I'm working with her staff on legislation that would incentivize prosecutor offices to collect more information about their low-level dockets. I want to second Professor Garrett's recommendation. Professor Jain's article, Arrest as Regulation, is really wonderful in the Stanford Law Review, but it goes to this question of governance, the way that we use the mechanisms of criminal justice, arrest, collateral consequences, these records, the marking. Is far more than just criminal justice incidents. They're part in the administration of our society that goes far beyond individual cases. And then just to circle back to Vikrant's very important point about what do we mean by public safety? And it's an easy question. Theoretically, when it comes to homicide, it's a very hard question when it comes to jaywalking and everything in between. And I think, we can talk more in the Q&A if people want to about order maintenance and about the debate over broken windows and whether it works. But I think the takeaway is that by focusing on the criminal system that we actually have, which is dominated by these low-level offenses, we can have a more nuanced conversation about when government intervention, when using the criminal system to do this work is appropriate, with all the costs, with all its social costs, with all its racial costs, with all its economic costs that we now are more aware of, whether that's the right governance tool to deal with littering.
Really great to hear that you're working on incentivizing data collection. Would love to hear more about that, because I think enticing these organizations and showing them how they can benefit from collecting the data is the right way, as opposed to necessarily cracking down in the first place. So how's that going? And how do you use that as an example for other nationwide, like low-level prosecutorial offices and whatnot?
So there's a wonderful relatively new organization called Measures for Justice, which for those of you who don't know about it, you should take a look. It is a nonprofit data collection organization that aims to create a national free database of criminal justice data for the entire country, state by state, county by county, so that researchers and advocates and legislators and the public can have access to a meaningful snapshot of the actual data pertaining to our criminal system. It was started by a woman named Amy Bach, who wrote a book a number of years ago called Ordinary Injustice. And the reason I'm digging into the backstory is because before she got pissed off at how little information out there was no such organization. And she raised foundation money to start it, and now there's a team of crackpot statisticians working with legislators all around the country, and criminal justice organizations all around the country to gather this data. So in 10 years, first of all, that landscape is going to look different. That there is an organization devoted to making that landscape look different. And it was invented by a person. And so when you start to think, oh, I'm a cog in a legal machine, so come to law school. Don't be a cog. When it starts to feel large and predetermined, I want to invite you to see how much is under-documented, under-theorized, under-litigated. We're only just starting to see the scope of unconstitutional practices in bail and debtor's prison and the lack of counsel. It was true 10 years ago, it was true 20 years ago, it was true 30 years ago. People weren't bringing those cases now. There's so much room for advocacy, for entrepreneurship, for data collection, for research. So I want to encourage you, even though it's disheartening in a way that there's so little, that there's so much to do, there's so much to do.
I think Professor Gershowitz touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering, given the scale of the problem, what you do about it. Do you think that the laws are okay and enforcement is problematic, or do the laws themselves need to be altered in some fundamental way for the issues that you discussed?
So the latter. The last chapter of the book is called Change, and I called it change rather than reform on purpose. Because I think when we say reform, we tend to think of your first example, efforts to change existing rules, to tweak existing rules, to fix enforcement of existing rules. And I think when it comes to our criminal system, have an opportunity to embark on a different way of thinking about our criminal system altogether. I think that's been the invitation of the conversation around mass incarceration. I think that's been the invitation around the innocence movement, to think differently about what we expect, the standards that we're going to hold our system to. And then I think the bottom line is, if we do nothing else, we need to think differently about misdemeanors. We need to understand that they're important. We need to abolish the term petty and minor from our vocabulary. There's nothing petty and minor about them. And when we start to think differently, then some rules will seem anachronistic and ridiculous, and some will feel like they need to be enforced differently or better. We will see the landscape differently.
Could I add? I can't resist.
I don't want to monopolize.
No. If you were to watch The Wire, which is the greatest source of all information in the criminal justice system, you'd see the incentive structure for the police is not the same incentive structure for the rest of the criminal justice system. So they're incentivized to bring in cases sometimes. And so you have to think of ways in which, maybe not legal requirements, but just interrelational or policy positions that you could impose that will prevent some of these cases from being put there in the first place. Because it's great if a prosecutor dismisses it, but not if the person loses their job by having been arrested, they lose their housing, they lose all. If you have to read this article, right, that Professor Jain has written, it shows all the problems that come even when the defendant is dismissed and never convicted of anything. And so you have to think through ways that the police are not going to bring certain cases into the system in the first place.
So speaking of change, it seems like the use of misdemeanors to solve public issues is a legislatively easy way to get around a lot of these problems. And while it seems like pretty much everybody can agree that the misdemeanor system is not functioning the way that it is supposed to, how do you get around blowback from, it's the way that you would non-criminally solve littering would be different than the way you would non-criminally solve something like theft or domestic violence. And so it's really complicated. So as you start to dismantle this broken misdemeanor system, at the same time you're trying to solve these existing societal problems, how do you avoid blowback as people start to get frustrated with all of the change and then just go back to a stronger version of what we had before? I mean, it seems like that's what happened when Nixon showed up and did all of his law and order response to the Warren Court.
Vikrant, you want to take a shot at shot first or second? I can go first.
I'll go second. I really want to know what you have to say. Yeah.
So you could say the same thing about education, tax code, housing, healthcare. Part of the takeaway is that the criminal system, and misdemeanors in particular, is one of the governance, complicated, messy governance tools that we use to deal with complicated, messy social and economic issues. And I think it's helpful to think about it that way. It's not just an academic trick to reframe it. It's to say we're doing all this work through misdemeanors. And so your point is well taken that we have to decide, should that work be done through the criminal system at all? And if we're not going to do it with the criminal system, do we have other mechanisms? One of the great strands running through a lot of this kind of criminal justice scholarship is recognizing that in many ways for the past, since the Great Society programs under Lyndon Johnson, we have been shifting work out of the welfare system and into the criminal system. That we have both criminalized poverty, but also criminalized the welfare state. And that is a policy shift that need not have happened. There's a wonderful book by Professor Elizabeth Hinton, who's a historian, called From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, and it traces how policymakers. So you're asking about how do we make those policy decisions? How policymakers literally changed the names of programs and shifted money and changed the priorities of programs to make it more about crime control and less about education and after-school programs and job training. And those are choices that we control. And so I think there's something until recently, the criminalization has sort of an inevitable cast to it. Well, it's a crime, so we need to respond in a criminal way. We decide what's a crime. We decide what governance tools to deploy. And I think it is by opening up that conversation and dispelling that inevitability that this is even a crime control problem that we will see other options. Bottom line is, you're right, it's complicated, but it's no more complicated than any other large, complex social welfare problem that we have dealt with for decades.
I guess I agree. It's incredibly complicated. It's really difficult. That's what makes it a hard question. The solution is going to be difficult too, because we have this culture that is so focused on the national narrative and national problem solving. And everybody's consumed with the 2020 presidential election, for example. But the solutions to problems like this are going to be local, ultimately, and it's going to require a lot of local experimentation and a lot of communities at a small level going, okay, we have this problem, we're going to try and solve it in some way that doesn't use the criminal justice system. And there's dozens of different problems, and there's dozens of different non-criminal justice solutions. So it's going to be challenging, but in the long run, that's what we'll have to do. I'll give you one small example just because it popped into mind, and it's kind of funny. I mentioned this criminal justice scholar named Mark Kleiman, who died last year. I was talking with him shortly, actually, I think it was my last conversation with him before he passed away. I was talking with him about the problem of turnstile jumpers. And I said, when you live in a city that has like a big subway or metro system, you've got these people, often young kids, who are jumping through the turnstiles, not paying. And I don't want to put these guys in jail. It just seems like that's more of a social cost than the turnstile jumping is. I guess we can write them tickets, but I had just read Eisha Natapoff's book, and I'm a little bit worried about burdening people as we drag them into the misdemeanor system. I mean, what do you do about a problem like this? And Kleiman, who's very inventive, said, you know what, we should just find ways to inconvenience them. And so what do you mean? He said, well, I mean, you don't write them a ticket, you don't put them in jail, but you just take the kid and you force them to sit in the police station for an hour. I said, is that even legal? He said, we'll worry about that in a second. But the broader idea here is that think of how annoyed you would be if you were trying to get somewhere and somebody just delayed you by an hour. And he said, if we could find some way to capture this insight and incorporate it into our law, incorporate it into our procedures, and just find ways that, are using the harsh hammer of the criminal justice system less, it'd be helpful. I don't know what I think of Professor Kleiman's solution there. I have some problems with it, starting with the due process legality issues. But I'm a lawyer, so I worry about those things. But I get his broader point. And ultimately, we're going to have to experiment with solutions like that, as I said, at the local level and see what works.
So first of all, I just want to comment on these tiny little microphones. This really puts me in my place as compared to your very large microphones up there. So well done, Duke. The question I have is about how you all feel about the future of change and the possibilities of developing consensus around simply how serious are these things? Are these crimes things that really bad people do, or are these minor little violations and things? So, and this I guess goes a little bit to Vikrant's point, is it seems to me that there is a lot of differences of opinions on these core topics, like people sleeping outside. I remember a case right before I became a law professor that I had about, it was out in Santa Cruz, and it was, an ordinance and related to like sleeping outside, right? And it was like, people have, I think, really strong opinions about homelessness and the threat that homeless people have, and whether that's this is very serious. These people are criminals, or these are people who are out, even among liberals, I think there's a real split on a topic like that. I think about trash. I think about, I live in a city, and crosswalks for me are big thing because I have little kids, and when people go by, whereas there are other people who are like, who, stop signs, who cares about this? Is nothing. And I wonder, like, in a best case scenario, are we, even in the community, not thinking nationally, going to be able to sit down and actually agree on this is really serious and this is not, or our cultural backgrounds, our commitments, are they going to prevent that from ever happening? So I'm just curious, people on the panel, and Sasha, obviously, sort of what your thoughts are.
I guess I'll just comment that, this is a question I've been thinking about a lot in the context of immigration. I think it's a similar question where you've got a population of 11 million people who we just think of as undocumented. That includes a DACA recipient who's been here since the age of 2. That includes the person who came to go to Disney World and overstayed their tourist visa by a week, right? We have very different intuitions about how these people ought to be treated, but the label, I think, obscures more than it illuminates. So part of why I think Sasha's work is so great is to, I think, start the process of saying, well, what's actually under this massive umbrella of misdemeanors? So I think the first step in the right direction is thinking about, what exactly is it that should be something that ought to be punished? And I think that is something that's very context specific. So that's going to look different in New York City than it will, I think, in a rural area, right? And so I think maybe the first step is to actually start talking about what conduct is appropriate to punish through the use of the criminal law. And then the second step is think about how we label it.
So sometimes people complain about the book that it's really depressing up until the last chapter, until the change chapter, and then the change chapter is all sunny. And they go, how do you get there? So I think the future of change is bright. I think that change is happening all the time. Do people here remember the Philly Starbucks trespassing case? The 2 African-American men who were arrested for trespassing, and the outpouring from all kinds of folks, but I want to focus especially on white people who responded like, you got to be freaking kidding us. I live at Starbucks. I do my laundry in the bathroom. Like, how is that, how is that trespassing? And I couldn't help but think that just a mere 10 years before, people wouldn't have seen it that way. That the conversation about mass incarceration, the conversation about Ferguson, the conversation about Black Lives Matter, the conversation about Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, the awareness about our criminal system is becoming more complicated. And you're right that we won't. So we don't need perfect agreement. We just need enough agreement to change. And I think that lots of things are changing and lots of things are up for grabs. It's an exciting moment to be a scholar. I think because there's a sense that, we could be meaningful parts of conversations that are changing things. I think it's a very exciting time to be a law student and a new lawyer. There's so many vistas opening up. Things are not settled in that way. So if you wanted an easy job, you wouldn't be in law school. So that it's not that I'm saying it's easy, but it seems to me to be a very open moment, and that bodes well for change.
There's a part in the book where you said the criminal justice system, I think you say this exactly, is like a whack-a-mole game where you hit one problem and another one sparks up. I feel like something like this is happening with reform at the moment, because I agree with everything you said about all the terrific criminal justice reforms that have been happening, the new attention that's being paid to the incarceration problem, and a lot of good things are happening. But as all of that is happening, this other conversation is sparking in the country about homelessness and vagrancy, and you asked about this in your question, and you even talked about the way that liberals are thinking about it. I'll tell a personal story. I have a relative who lives in San Francisco. He is as far left as it gets. Over the holidays, we were talking, and he kind of pulled me aside from the rest of the family because he knows I have some views that can tend a little right-wing, and he said, I gotta tell you, I'm as left as it gets. But back home in San Francisco, it's out of control. The homelessness, the heroin needles I'm seeing everywhere, the trash. even I, as far left as I am starting to get a little bit concerned that San Francisco's got to do something to get this under control. I didn't know what to tell them, but I know that that kind of conversation is happening a lot in communities like that. I've seen a lot of reporting about it in the Times, the Economist, and all these places. All I will say is, as we try to get a handle on those problems in cities like that, let's just keep in mind things that we've done in the past that may have been short-term solutions, but that were very counterproductive in the long run. Hopefully we have more data points about that kind of stuff now, and let's just be careful moving forward. But let's also take the concerns of guys like my relative in San Francisco seriously.
Related to that, so there's a lot of, I think, movement towards consensus and becoming less punitive, but it's interesting to think about ways in which society has moved towards being a little bit more punitive and taking certain misdemeanors more seriously. I think the book does a good job of this. So if you went back 40 years ago, DWI was not considered a serious crime. And I think today people have recognized that is a thing we need to be worried about. Same is true for domestic violence. And so I do think that there's room for us to sort of say, it takes a while, right? But there's consensus to be had around some of these things.
Thank you all so much.
That's fun. You'll get a kick out of this. This is a copy of the book you sent me and even wrote